I'm Jacqueline Kagune, and I'll be making the first part of this presentation. So we just start right off, and on your screen is basically, just go back, Leo, the 2023, it's the cover of the 2023 publication, and it's a publication by the Heritage Foundation, and we've looked at it annually. Every year, we've looked at every issue of the Freedom of Economic Index, the Index of Economic Freedom, and we've looked at the key results, both from Kenya and from the EAC. So this publication usually covers for instance, for the 2023 index, it covers the period between July, the 1st of July of 2021 and the 30th of June of 2022. So it's up to last year, the period that we'll be referring to for this session. So we can move to the next slide. In terms of an outline, this is the outline of our presentation. I'll cover the first part, which is I'll begin with the background. And here we'll basically be restating why the freedom of economic, this index is important. The Index of Economic Freedom is important. We'll restate why we've been tracking it every year. For those of you who've attended our annual webinars, because we've been having this webinar for say 3 years now, this should be the 4th year, you'll bear with us because it's a repetition of the justification for why. I'll describe how the index is measured, and then we will look at the interpretation of economic freedoms, and I'll provide an overview of the Kenyan scores. Then Leo will provide in detail what this means, what the Kenyan scores mean, and then he will look at the EAC results and make some key observations as well as conclusions and recommendations. So next. So the little background, this slide says, why is IEA tracking the index? And we've explained this previously, but again, we make the assumption that not everyone on this call today has been attending all the webinars. So for your sake, we're going to explain. But before I explain the 4 main justifications from the constitutional perspective, economic freedom, so that we are all on the same page. The description of economic freedom that has been provided by the Heritage Foundation is that it's about freedom of choice, and it's basically about the freedom of choice that individuals have, both in terms of the acquisition of resources and also the utilization of the same resources. It measures countries' performance or evaluates countries' performance across 12 economic freedoms, which are categorized, and I will explain later, into 4 broad areas, and basically evaluates how different countries have performed across each of these areas. So Leo will explain in detail the justification later for economic freedoms, but the rationale basically for advocating for why economic freedom is important, which we've seen from the index, the results year in, year out, is that it provides, we see evidence that when governments tend to impose themselves into the economic decision-making of individuals and restrict an individual's ability to make choice, those actions usually tend mostly towards, or it has implications towards coercion or standardization. And this restriction of freedom is the implications are negative, both for the individual, but also for the state in terms of economic growth and prosperity. These restrictions usually tend to impede efficiency and often leads to a waste of resources. And that is just partly what we see as being revealed by the findings of this index every year. So in a nutshell, that's why it tends to promote for economic freedom, or rather to advance the promotion of economic freedom, but we will have those slides later on further justification. Then regarding why we've been tracking this index annually, you see that first, our constitution guarantees under various articles, the Constitution basically guarantees economic freedoms amongst other rights. Chapter 4 of the Bill of Rights, right from Article 40, which guarantees property rights, and then which also includes intellectual property, broadly all property rights, but including intellectual property. We have Article 43 on economic and social rights. We have the right to fair labor practices under Article 41, consumer rights under Article 46, and the Constitution goes on and on and provides quite a bit of detail with regards to the enjoyment or the guarantee of those rights to an individual. Then second, this index, as John had mentioned, allows for comparison, and it basically allows for peer comparison, both amongst countries. So countries who are at our level. It provides also comparison between other countries in globally, other jurisdictions, those who are far more advanced, for instance, as opposed to ours, and helps us see what areas we can make improvements. So if, for instance, we have some indicators where Kenya is performing badly, we are able to check that against what our peers or what those who are doing better than us have scored, and measure that and see, because it provides justification for each of the rankings and see what could be done better. So those are the first two reasons. Then on the third reason, we say that it's a useful tool in terms of assessing the constitutional order, and basically the rationale or what this means is that it helps us to assess the interaction between Kenyan citizens and state institutions, and to what extent the state institutions promote or advance enjoyment of various rights, and how it benefits or what implications it has on the economy. So it basically allows us to see how different actions and restrictions by the state or government institutions affect opportunities for prosperity by the citizens. Then lastly, we say that that reason why we've been tracking this index is that it's a necessary path for the path to economic prosperity and structural transformation. And here, basically, what we are saying is that the pursuit of economic freedoms leads to economic prosperity, and this will be demonstrated later as we explain. The results of this index usually have shown that countries that have an institutional environment that is favorable, or where individuals and different firms have a high degree of economic freedom, moderate to high degree of economic freedom, tend to record more prosperity, greater development, and so we should all be aspiring towards that. So we go to the next slide. So again, if you've attended our previous webinars, please bear with us, because this is our repetition or re-explanation of what we've talked about before. But in terms of how the index is measured, remember I started by saying that it evaluates countries' performance across 12 different economic freedoms that are categorized into 4 areas. And the 4 areas are on the rule of law, the size of government, regulatory efficiency, and open markets. So under the rule of law, the indicators or factors, as you can see, the index measures property rights, judicial effectiveness, and government integrity. Then in terms of the government size, basically the index looks at the tax burden, government spending, and fiscal health, among other things. And then in terms of, can move to the next, the third category, which is on regulatory, on regulatory efficiency. Let's move to the next slide. Yeah, so on in terms of the regulatory efficiency, the index basically measures business freedom, labor freedom, and monetary freedom. I am not going into detail because this will be explained later, but we've also done this annually. So we make an assumption that there's some basic understanding. And then the fourth, under the fourth category, which is on open markets, it measures different things. And some of this includes trade freedom, investment freedom, and financial freedom. So different scores are computed across the different categories. And we go to the next slide, which is basically on how, once the scores are provided and aggregated, how then we are supposed to interpret the different scores. So for the interpretation of the different economic freedom scores, the scoring is usually done on a scale of 0 to 100. And then the scale of economic freedom is usually derived like from an average of all the scores. And the classification is structured like the end score that each country is provided across the different areas is classified into 5 different categories. And then, and this is what is shown in this table here. So of course, for the countries that have an average score between 0 to 49.9, the index categorizes these economies as repressed economies. That's in terms of the economic freedom, so they're repressed economies. Then for the countries that have a score between 50 and 59.9, these are classified as mostly unfree. Then for the countries that have the next score between 60 and 69.9, these are classified as moderately free, while those between 70 and 79.9 are mostly free. And then the best score here is usually between 80 and 100, or the A students, and these ones are classified as free economies. And basically, as will be shown, it's usually a reflection of the enjoyment or the extent to which economic freedom in that particular state has been promoted, and what we should all basically be aspiring to. Then for the next slide. So having stated that background, what has been Kenya's score over the years, or what do we see as Kenya's score? So this chart basically provides an overview of how Kenya has been performing over the last 6 years. So you see, again, we have been in the category of because all the scores are between 50. So it's actually been a decline from 54.7 in 2018. We are now at 52.5. I think the worst performance over that period, but then we remain consistent in our performance as mostly unfree. So our ranking has been consistently placed as mostly unfree in terms of our economic freedom. And particularly for this 2023 index, Kenya was ranked 135 out of 184 countries. And as you can see in that chart, our score was 52.5. It's just been a very minimal change. It's still a decline, but minimal from last year, where the score was 52.6. And in terms of the regional performance, we were ranked 29. In the sub-Saharan African region, we were ranked 29 out of 47 countries. And again, as was the performance last year, this performance remains to be below the world average and also below the regional average. And then before I let my colleague Leo go into the next slide, basically for Kenya's performance, because the index provides reasons and explanations for why they have arrived at certain scores. For Kenya, they say that the reasons for this performance is that the foundations of our economic freedom in Kenya are fragile. they have remained to be fragile and they are uneven across the country. It's not, we do not have the same performance in terms of any of these indicators across the country. So this performance has been attributed to poor protection of property rights, continued widespread corruption, which has implications for businesses and implications for entrepreneurial activity. And as you will see in the results for this year, which is similar to the last couple of years, we tend to, the country has performed not, okay, I'll say poorly in terms of the rule of law. So the report points out that the rule of law in Kenya is weak, and we tend to have quite a bit of interference, substantial political interference in terms of our in terms of our judicial system, in terms of the courts and decision making, and this has contributed to the fact that the rule of law scores have been very low, and also what we all know, the tendency towards impunity by various state government officials. So the report also points to the fact that we've had sluggish or below average performance in terms of progress in advancing the management of our public finances. And I think this will be, greater detail will be provided for this. So with that, I'll usher in my colleague Leo to take us to specific scores. And
now to just explain the results for the four main pillars of the index, and the first one is the one on rule of law. If you check the color indicated for the first three on the rule of law, which property rights, judicial effectiveness, and government integrity, all of them are marked in red, and that indicates the aspect of repression. And like Jackie explained, part of the problem with the property rights, the property rights is undermined by institutional factors institutional factors related to government integrity, and also on the effectiveness of the judicial system. The score for property rights is 39.7, then obviously for judicial effectiveness 38.9, and then for government integrity, what Jack explained is that it measures on irregular payments and bribes. It measures the aspect of transparency in government policy making. It also measures the perceptions on corruptions, and also the openness of government, the perception of corruption both in the entire government setup and also in the civil service. So, and that one is marked 30. No wonder, I think most Kenyans understand why this score is at that, and largely it's due to the fiscal the problems in the fiscal leakages in the Kenya's public finance management system. The one of the judiciary is also tied to structural factors like case resolution. Most cases, Kenya has a serious case backlog problem in the judiciary. While efforts are being made to actually resolve that problem, still the number of cases, close to 700,000, are lagging behind, with some of them going back as 15, 20 years back, especially those that relate to environment and land court. So those are some serious problems on the rule of law. So overall, the entire rule of law is weak. If you see the dotted lines above, those are world averages. On government size, it measures three things, which is the tax burden, government spending, fiscal health. Kenya, its score is 10.8, which is considered repressive. So, and largely on the fiscal health, what it measures is the average deficit for the past 3 years. And additionally, the debt as a share of GDP. Kenya's public debt is around 69%, percent of GDP. But if you had the component of what is called the publicly guaranteed debt to state-owned entities, and of which much of it is starting to crystallize, the share goes up. The average deficits for the last 3 years, the deficit for this the deficit average has been around 7.88%, and obviously the government spending. On the government spending side, that the score is 81%, which is considered mostly free, while the tax burden is considered free. And on the other side, the tax burden is 79% is considered mostly free. The one on the more dark green is considered free, while the other one is considered mostly free. In comparative terms, one thing as economists, while that tax burden is considered mostly free, as economists we don't take more, because the marginal tax rate for a personal payee for payee and all for the income tax for personal income tax is 30%, while the one for companies is also 30%. In relative terms, in comparative terms with other countries, especially the European countries, that could look small, but it could look small, but in essence, it's not a desirable. That 30% is not, for the level of our income, is not a desirable tax rate. Then the third main pillar is the one on regulatory efficiency, and it measures three things, which is business freedom, labor freedom, and monetary freedom. The monetary freedom in lighter green is considered mostly free, but this year's index cites weaknesses to the monetary stability, the problems of rising inflation, and then on the other side, the business freedom is the score is 56, which is considered mostly and free. And there are two significant problems, which is one, the aspect of government regulation, regulating prices, or government interventions in the market economy. So we all understand that there are some key, what government considers as key sector, key strategic assets to say, like the interventions in the oil market, the interventions in the vegetable oil market, rice, the flour, maize flour, mostly in cereals. Other interventions actually contributed to what you'd consider to the business freedom, to the scope of the business freedom. Secondly, the question about the labor freedom ranked 57, and the way what Jackie explained with the labor freedom is what they're looking at is the questions of notice, labor force participation rates. They're looking at minimum wage. They're looking at just those regulatory questions around labor, and comparing it with what the global conventions considers to be the optimum. And then, so Kenya's is considered mostly and free. On the other side, on the question of open market, they measure three major things. One of them is the trade freedom, investment freedom, and the financial freedom. On the trade freedom side, they consider the average weighted tariff, the ability of government, the ability of government to intervene in the trade policy. On the investment side, what they measure the investment freedom is how foreign investments is treated, which includes whether that ownership is restricted, and the role that the state-owned entities play in the private sector development. And obviously on the financial freedom is the extent of government regulation in that sector. Number two, degree of state intervention in the banking sector. The third issue that they also look at is that the extent of market development. No doubt, the report observes Kenya's financial freedom, the financial sector markets are well developed. Number two is that the level of competition, for example, aspects of banking like retail banking, is there's a little bit more of competition. But now, on the extent of the state interventions, the state intervention is something that is considered that and that's why you see the score of 50, which is considered mostly unfree, and any percentage point decline actually the financial freedoms in Kenya would be considered repressive. So what you observe in terms of open markets is that foreign ownership in sectors, some sectors is restricted, and there are local content regulations on those in those sectors. Then number two, the question about state-owned enterprises. They undermine private sector development because state-owned enterprises are propped up by government regulations to become market leaders per se. And then obviously the question about government regulation with related to prices. Now, so we move away from the Kenya results now to start to discuss the EAC results. For the EAC results for this year, the 2023 year, we compare Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda. Rwanda is an outlier. So we compare the EAC 4 countries. Rwanda and South Sudan would be outliers. So we compare the EAC 4 countries. So if you look at the overall score, now when you aggregate the open markets, regulatory efficiency, when you regulate, you aggregate the aspect of property, the rule of law and government size. So those four key pillars, this is the result that you get for the EAC. So if you look at Tanzania, Tanzania is considered moderately free with a score of around 61 in 2023. If you look at the four EAC countries, none of them has made significant shifts, with the exception of Burundi. With the exception of Burundi, and Burundi made some small shifts. Some small shifts. Then, but it's still considered, Burundi is still considered to be repressive, to be in the repressed zone. Secondly, both Uganda made some small percentage decline, while Kenya's performance remained constant. For Tanzania, it still remains the leader comparing if you compare the four countries together, but its performance has remained constant with some declines in 2021, some improvements in 2019, but some declines in 2020 and 2021. The overall picture is that if you look at what you'd consider the shining stars of EAC, with only the exception of Tanzania, with the exception of Tanzania, most of them, the other three are in the mostly unfree and in the repressed category. So it means a lot of efforts are needed to be done to change the pathway. While Kenya remains the EAC's dominant economy, both in nominal terms and on per capita terms, you'd look at when you look at it critically. When you look at it critically, and with a very strong constitutional framework, its performance on economic freedoms is still something that needs to be to be examined. And if you look at when the index was started in 1995 up to present, Kenya's performance with a score 55.2 has gone back by -2. So it shows that that performance is a problem. Now to look at some select specific rights on, we start with property rights. Kenya's performance was higher in 2018. It was considered moderately free. In 2020, considered moderately free, but in 2021-22, and it declined, it slid back to repressed, and to repressed. And if you can see in 2023, it scores, it starred in comparative terms, the four countries. Burundi remains in the repressed region. Tanzania improved in 2022 with some percentage points, but it's still in the repressed region. None of all these countries is in the moderately free with a score of 60 and above. And that's also still part of the problem that relates to the rule of law. One thing also, another thing to note is the judicial effectiveness. And in terms of judicial effectiveness, what the score measures is the judicial independence, the quality of the judicial process, and favoritism in obtaining judicial decisions. Now, if you look at all the EAC 4 countries, none of them is in the region of moderately free. All countries, including Kenya, are in the mostly in the repressed category, which is a score of 50 and below. In comparative terms, Kenya still leads higher with a still leads high with a score of around 39. Tanzania and Uganda to score almost 35, 30, and then obviously Burundi is in the repressed category. It is low, slightly low, almost close to 10. And this is a problem. And judicial independence, based on the study that there is a study that IEA has undertaken on Kenya's just costing the mandate of the judiciary. And one of the questions is the definition of judicial independence is how do you the ability of parliament as a pass holder to give resources to the judiciary without expecting the judiciary, for example, to go in a certain direction or in a certain line. If use what we call the Commonwealth Latimer definition, you look at the independence of judiciary in terms of resources, and secondly, just the direction of day-to-day operations of the judiciary. And if you look at that, that's judicial independence. And another question is on the quality of the judicial process, meaning your cases go to court, they are resolved on time, and you're able to move forward from. And on those sides, if you look at those two critical issues, Kenya still lags behind, both on the ability of parliament to meet the consumer mandate of the judiciary on an independence basis without expecting judiciary to toe in a certain line. And secondly, the question of the judicial process, the ability of the judiciary to resolve those cases within a shorter time. And those two across EAC is still a problem. The third question is government integrity, which is now the perception of corruption, irregular payments, and bribe, and then the absence of transparency in government policy making. All the EAC 4 countries we sampled, Tanzania, Uganda, and Kenya, and Burundi, all of them are still category position. And without just to comment on the place of Kenya in this, you don't need to look far. If you look at the Auditor General reports, if you look at the other agencies like the control of budget, if you look at the IMF, the problem of fiscal slippage, the problem of how decisions generally are made by government is still a problem. Then on fiscal health, all the with exception of Tanzania, most which is considered mostly free. The Uganda was in the last 6 years in the region of moderately free, but its performance has dwindled over the past the past 5 years. And just to remind what Jackie explained, what fiscal health measures is the deficit as a percentage of GDP, average 3-year deficit, and then secondly, the debt as a percentage of GDP, which deficit carry 80% of the score, and debt carries the debt indicator carries 20% of the score. If you look at this, Kenya has been on almost at 10, a score of 10 from 2018, and it's because of those large fiscal deficits that Parliament and National Treasury went with that. So it's largely fiscal deficit, and you're able to see that, and you'll be able to see that. So the judiciary, so the fiscal health is an indicator of the PFM, the public finance management architecture, because across this EAC, there is a rule that was agreed that the fiscal deficit benchmark in EAC should be 3% of GDP. But most of them have gone overboard that benchmark. The business freedom, and in the business freedom, what it measures is the cost of setting up businesses. It has almost like 13 indicators. If you look at those 13 indicators, it's actually on time. It's functions on time and cost and the procedure of setting up a business. And if you look at the score, Kenya is in the region of mostly and free, and is the leader within the EAC, while the rest are in the regions of repressed, with the exception of Burundi, which score and Burundi, which has a very low score in that context. And the biggest argument if you look at the biggest argument, including by the IEA business membership organizations like Kenya Association of Manufacturers and the rest, the thing is that the cost of setting up a business, the cost, the regulations, and the time required to meet all these regulatory approvals is still something that can be improved. And this is testament to that. On the labor freedom, as Jack explained, it's the minimum ratio of the minimum wage to the added value, to the value had per worker. Another thing is the hindrance to hiring additional workers, the aspect of rigidity of those workers, of those hours, firing the regulations that bar firing of redundant workers, amongst other things. And if you look at the performance, Kenya's score overall in the last 5 years has been considered moderately free, and then it declined in 2020, the COVID period, and has not recovered beyond, and is considered mostly unfree from COVID period up to today. Then, of course, obviously, if you look at the what to consider Uganda, which was free up to also 2021, where all those regulations, where there was a regulation shift, and you can see the 2022 result is considered mostly unfree, and then obviously the 2023 result. So mostly these are regulations. These are like what the employment labor laws and the regulations. It's just to conform, changing them to conform to the conventional standards. And then obviously the trade freedom is the it evaluates two things. One is the tariff barriers, and then obviously the non-tariff barriers. If you look at the EAC, most EAC countries are considered mostly unfree, with the exception of most of them are considered moderately free, with the exception of Burundi, which is considered Burundi and Uganda, which is considered moderately, mostly moderately and free, with exception of Burundi and Uganda, which is considered mostly and free. And it's the question of mostly for EAC, the EAC has a common market protocol. Much of the problem is not even on the countervailing measures or on the other side. Most of it is on non-tariff barriers. Non-tariff barriers. There are so many non-tariff barriers that form largely a problem of expanding trade freedom. So if you look, for example, if you look at this, just to give an example, the Kenyan president and the Tanzanian president met and agreed to have a joint committee to resolve non-tariff barriers. They're reporting that they resolved 23 non-tariff barriers between Kenya and Tanzania alone. So those are some of the things that where reform could come in to resolve that. And then obviously the investment freedom. Most of EAC countries are considered mostly and free. They all have the same results in 2023, close to 56, and then with the exception of Burundi. And the investment freedom measures the treatment of foreign investment code, sectoral investment restrictions, expropriations of investments without compensation, foreign exchange controls, and capital controls. And you can easily see why Kenya's score would be at that place. Some of it is structural, like our constitution limits some foreign ownership on land. There are some questions, for example, people who owned land in Kenya before the 2010 constitution, because our constitution specifically limits ownership on that. But secondly, the foreign investment code, the application on that, some receive preferential treatment, others do not. Others, foreign exchange controls. This is related to transfer of forex, foreign exchange, and so largely this is if you are to suggest a reform agenda for this, it would be liberalization. How do you liberalize further to improve that aspect of investment freedom? And then obviously financial freedom. Most of the EAC is in the repressed region. Kenya's score is around 50, same as Tanzania. Burundi is lower at 30, and uh, and excuse me, at 30. And uh, the major things that this financial freedom measures is the extent of regulation of financial services, the financial sector, the degree of intervention in the banking sector and other financial firms, the government influence in allocation of credit, and of course, the extent of uh, financial market development and the open, whether this sector is open to foreign ownership. And that's a, and you look at those results like Kenya, but largely you all remember the interest rate controls, but still the extent, the aggressiveness of regulation of regulation towards uh, uh, providers in this sector, and the ability to allow markets to function effectively in the intermediation. It's something that those as inhibited financial freedom. Now we wanted to end these why economic freedoms, and this the economic system should be based on private property and free markets, and it should be characterized by personal choice and voluntary exchange, and there should be freedom to compete in markets, and obviously the protection of people and property. And then government plays a role by providing a legal structure and an enforcement system that protects the rights of owners and enforcement of those contracts. What these economic freedoms requires governments to refrain from is taking people's property and then interfering in those in the freedoms to contract, which is personal choices, voluntary exchange, and the freedom to enter in to compete in both labor markets and product markets. So that is why economic freedoms. This is the entire justification for why economic freedoms. Now, this year we're also thinking that we should need to introduce the literature, the research around this, that there's a clear link between economic freedoms and prosperity. Because if you look at economic data, economic freedoms, countries that are ranked with high economic freedoms have high incomes, economic growth, income equality, gender equality, life expectancy, and those better welfare outcome indicators. Then lowest income people in freer countries are better off than those in the less free countries. And then this is from some research that was done, that 1 percentage point decline in the economic freedom index is associated with a long-term reduction in long-term growth of GDP between 1 and 1.5% percentage points annually. And if you take the factor of time and compound it, that's a larger reduction. And then economic freedoms leads to better economic results. Now, this is given that this is the Adam Smith's what we call the Adam Smith year, and the IEA has been thinking of the Adam Smith events. Adam Smith is, as you all know, is one of the pioneer economists to lay out actually the thinking behind various principles in economics today, from the markets, division of labor, the power of the invisible hand, to universities, to use. Adam Smith was like a polymath. His thinking was around so many so many around many areas in the general economy, but we wanted to pick some quotes related to directly freedoms. And one of the things that Adam Smith observed, for example, on tax burden, tax burden is one of the indicators that is measured in the under economic freedoms. Is that if you read the Wealth of Nations, chapter 2, paragraph 6, 456, page 456, paragraph 10, that there is no heart in which one government sooner learns of another than that of draining money from pockets of people. So it means what Smith observed is that government's inhibition to stop taxing more does not stop, and it's an art that government perfects. So what has economy, what, and this was way before literature on taxation developed, that what should be the restraint you on tax burden is to have a smaller government, have smaller governments, or spend less. If now in talking fiscal policy as a share of GDP. So if you're spending 30% like Kenya, obviously, and your revenue 30% as a share of GDP, and your revenue is 17%, it means your fiscal deficits will be higher. It also means your overall tax burden would be higher. It means the other indicators, obviously, would have the ones that we are thinking that we've shown you in the economic freedoms would be higher. Then obviously, on the benefits of freedom, he also commented that on that the Wealth of Nations, Book 1, Chapter 8, paragraph 96, page 96, paragraph 36, that without trade restrictions, the obvious and simple system of natural liberty establishes itself on its own accord, that every man is left perfectly to pursue his interest in his own way, and the sovereign is completely discharged from the duty. No human wisdom or knowledge could ever be sufficient. The duty of superintending the industry of private people and of directing it towards the employment of suitable interests of the society. So here, it's the power of markets, that the open markets, whether it's those in trading freedom, investment freedom, financial freedom, labor freedom, all those different kinds of freedoms. Actually, if you leave every man to for himself, and then obviously regulating because of those externalities, which are perfectly justified, but that aspect of superintending people is what Adam Smith warned people of. So obviously, our score is affected by two things. One, there are structural issues. And we show one example like that one on judicial effectiveness and case backlogs. Then the second issue is now fiscal slippage. You have to continue fiscal slippage. When you fix things, for example, such as a bigger size of government, like your formal sector employment, 962,000 out of 3 million people work in government, you're fixed up a structural problem. So those issues, or if you have a fiscal slippage problem and you don't zero-base budgets, those are structural problems, and it shows them in the fiscal health of the nation. Or if you have government integrity, if you don't think like if you privatize, for example, government procurement, if you take out that government procurement, if you don't take out that government procurement, you will see it in those regular payments. So those are various things. And then this is a useful indicator. And three, what Jackie observed is that the those aspects of freedom, economic freedom in Kenya are fragile and even across different countries, different parts of the country. Thank you so much.
Thank Kemboi and Jackie for breaking down the Index of Economic Freedom 2023. You've taken us through the methodology and the overall results for Kenya vis-a-vis our neighbors in the East Africa community, and concluded with nice key messages that maybe I do not need to reiterate. So given that our time, that we don't have much time, I will go straight and open it up for plenary. So I'd like to allow, again, the usual drill, we'll have 2 rounds. So in this first round, feel free to raise your hand, and I already see Dominic. Maybe Dominic, you can go first. You can pose your question or make a comment to either of the 2 presenters. Dominic? Dominic, are you there, please? You can unmute yourself and pose your question. Okay, as anyone else who would like to ask a question? What do I see here? See. Chaitanya?
Yes, thank you so much. I was particularly curious about how the index measures rights versus freedoms. So when it was categorizing things like labor freedoms, it mentioned, the period required before you can fire someone, or minimum wage policies and things like that. And I wanted to know a little bit more about um, whether the index takes into consideration like laws put in place to prevent labor exploitation versus other kinds of labor rights.
Okay,
Thank you.
thanks for that, Chaitanya. Do you have anyone else who would like to, before we go to the chat box? I've seen 2 questions in the chat box. Okay, maybe I should just read those 2. So Kemboy and Jackie, I hope you've noted what Chaitanya has asked. The question from Chaitanya. So we have a query from Maunda. So on the rule of law pillar, would it be more beneficial if we were to privatize protection of private property? And the third question from Buvi is, what is IEA's take on the previously amended rule to have the executive privatize or rather protect state property without the inclusion of MPs or the legislature? So we have those 3 questions. Now let's see. So Jackie, maybe you can go first. You can pick any of the 3, and then Kemboy, you can add to what Jackie will have mentioned.
It looks at different things. First of all, it evaluates overall a country's overall policies and laws related to employment and labor relations. Specific things, some of the specific things that are looked at are, for instance, to what extent are you able to hire additional workers? What's the minimum wage policy? What is the freedom in terms of working hours? That's the rigidity of hours. Does the law facilitate or restrict hiring and firing, for instance, of redundant employees? What's the notice period that is required? And what's the severance pay? What's the labor participation rate? So there's different pillars, or rather different indicators that are looked at with regards to the labor freedom and to what extent the rights guaranteed by an individual countries, I would believe the overarching laws. So the rights guaranteed with regards to employment and labor, and to what extent the existing laws facilitate this. So obviously you get lower scores for more restrictive laws, but for the laws that expand or promote the advancement or the enjoyment of those particular rights, they get the scores that are provided are higher. But if the laws within a specific jurisdiction are restrictive with regards to any of these elements, then of course they get the lower scores. So that's what I would say. Somebody is unmuted. Sorry. So that's what I would say with regards to that. But Leo will add in case I didn't get your question correctly. And then Mbuvi asks, what's IEA's take on the previously amended rule to have the executive privatize or protect state property without inclusion of MP? My colleagues can also speak to this, but not IEA's position, but my position on this, I would say, I think because the Constitution allocates and demarcates the different roles of the three arms of government, and Parliament in particular is given a very clear role in terms of legislation and in terms of oversight and representation. I do not think that it's within the executive's right to actually privatize or actually undertake any such action without the express authority by the legislature. Remember that the representative of you and I, or that representative role is vested in the legislature. And so by the executive implementing such a decision without Parliament's input, I think it's an overlaps of the mandates of the different institutions. And I think I disagree with that position, but this is not the IEA position. Any of my other colleagues here could respond to that. And it's something that I think we could debate and see. Then before I read the other questions, I think Leo can.
Question on laws against labor exploitation. So one of the things is when they are checking, for example, for those legal mandates, they are checking against those forms of labor exploitation, and here it's on hours, wiring, the ability to hire, that ratio of minimum wage to the value had per worker. So they are looking at forms of labor exploitation. I think so. That one, the only thing for me, I think, could be the limitation of that part is, laws exist, but now the enforcement aspect, because the enforcement aspect is because that enforcement aspect is a public good, which is to have those labor inspectors to go from one place to the other to ensure that those that the employers, for example, adhere to those kind of regulations, is something that it could be questioned, because there are other countries that, like for example in Kenya, where that problem of shortage of labor inspectors ends up adding to the fact that while the laws exist and laws are available against labor exploitation, that problem ends up compounding the overall problem. So that's to add to what Jackie spoke about, the question from Chaitanya. The question by on the root of law, will it be more beneficial if we're to privatize protection of private property? Now, here, as we take the economic, where the economics at, whereby we say, if private protection of people is a public good, which is it means that it's efficient if that was provided by government of Kenya. that we could allow, but in terms of efficiency and the efficiency part, which is still emphasized in our constitution, that protection of public property is a public good, which should be focused, which should be something that must be provided by government of Kenya. So would it be more beneficial? No, in terms of efficiency, no. But government of Kenya should focus on fewer things, which is those public goods and those constitutional obligations like Article 43, Article 53, 54 on youth, 55 on and the ones on older people, the ones on children, and the economics and social rights. The government of Kenya should focus on fewer things and do it better. On the question by movie, what would be amended rule on the executive, allowing executives to bypass parliament? That's obviously blatantly unconstitutional. That one should be challenged once that legislation is tabled, should be challenged. If that legislation is passed, should be challenged from the word go. We looked at we studied the Privatization Act, and we looked at the process where we summed it up to 5 stages, of which the first 3 stages are within the domicile of the executive arm of government, whereby the cabinet secretary is supposed to develop a paper. The Privatization Commission is supposed to map out those agencies for privatization and then send it to the cabinet secretary in charge of national treasury. The cabinet secretary is supposed to, from there, develop a sessional paper, which is supposed to be approved by cabinet and then obviously approved in parliament. None of those sessional papers has ever reached parliament. Question about financial freedom. Financial freedom does not measure does not measure inflation. The inflation is measured by monetary freedom, which is part of the regulatory efficiency. So that's just so the question about inflation, as we all know, there are tools to deal with inflation, and I don't think it relates directly to whether you are backed by what forms of whether it's gold or silver that backs your financial system. What actually ensures stability of financial system is economic fundamentals. If you have stable macroeconomic indicators, but generally when you have stronger economic performance. On the second question about privatization of courts, this is a public good. It's very efficient when and based on a constitutional order and the constitutional architecture. While alternative forms of private judicial resolutions could be suggested that could be very helpful. It's important that the public good, where a judge, an arbitrator that can arbitrate against the state and against the state and its citizens, or against between different citizens, is an important part of public goods. So it needs to remain like that. So I think while that can be indicated, a stronger judiciary funded by public exchequer, strongly oversighted by parliament and its citizens is an important part. So John, maybe I yield back to you so that you can continue from there.
So Jackie, maybe if you want to make any additional comments on the judicial effectiveness, you can respond to that one. And then there is another one on private property. Can private firms be included in property management and property protection? A free market solution for residential associations to be in charge to collect land rates and title deeds. Title deed management on behalf of private owners, while government to be in charge of government land and probably community land to deal with the freeloader problem. And then his final comment on regulatory efficiency. So what Dominic notes is that according to George Stigler's work, we have a regulatory capture problem. It exists in all our regulatory bodies. Would it be a better arrangement for blanket deregulation of all sectors to open up competition in all sectors? Keeping in mind, his hypothesis has been proven true considering the limiting of competitors through license fees, and number of regulations. And then finally, on courts, health education has been termed as public good, but still can be provided for by private sector the same way security can be provided by private sector. Okay, so those are, I think, a rundown of some of the additional questions, largely from and comments from Dominic. I do not see any other comments or questions in the chat box. So what I will do is allow my two colleagues to respond to any of these final questions and also make their final remarks. I think just to give Leo a breather, Jack, you can go first, and then Leo, you can conclude.
One on judicial effectiveness. I agree entirely with Leo's response, where he's stated that for the most efficient outcome, it would be best to allow the courts or the judiciary to discharge of that mandate because they have the sole responsibility for the administration of justice. Notably, the Constitution, when it talks about the principles of which are supposed to guide judicial authority in Article 159, it talks about, it makes an addition with regards to the promotion for alternative forms of dispute resolution, says that the ADR should be considered, that's the mediation, arbitration, traditional dispute resolution, should be promoted, but I would go with the word promoted, not to replace, because the suggestion that I see in this question is to advocate more for commercial disputes being solved separately through ADR. I think on the I think the sole responsibility for settlement of such disputes should be the judiciary, but where possible or where necessary, then you can have ADR, but not in the first instance. I think that's the most efficient outcome given our constitutional architecture. And he says something about that the private courts shouldn't be under the Ministry of Justice. I think certainly, again, because of the principles of separation of power and the requirement for an independent judiciary, I think they should certainly should not be placed under the ministry. All the tribunals should have the main reporting role being placed under the judiciary. I know this tends to happen because of maybe the budget structures for some of these tribunals, which are placed within those respective parent ministries, but I don't think that should be the case. And again, referring to our arguments for adequate resource provision for an efficient judiciary, why not place all the additional or all the necessary resources that are required for the judiciary to efficiently discharge its mandate with the judiciary, and then let all the tribunals fall thereunder. So that would be my response to that. Then for Dominic, I see these are mostly comments, but what I pick, the main thing that I pick here was, would it be a better arrangement for blanket deregulation of all sectors to open up competition in all the sectors? With regards to the question that he's asked, I think certainly yes. And the essence of advancing economic freedom, the essence of expanding the different economic freedoms that we've defined is to, as much as possible, allow for openness, allow for autonomy, allow for competition. And I think allowing competition, I have not heard of many instances where allowing for competition has been negative. So I think my response to that would be that yes, opening up competition in most of the sectors would be beneficial to allow for choice, to allow for the options, basically. I think Dominic says, I think you should explore the case studies of private courts and their performance. Adjudicates in the US, I will give other examples. I think that we should do. They are individuals. Okay, yeah, we will definitely explore that, and because I think that's also a comment, but that's my feedback. And then in terms of my closing remarks, I would say, and in the spirit of Leo's reference to several quotes today, one that I found particularly poignant was a quote from the president of the Heritage Foundation, who mentioned that economic freedom is not a gift. It's re-earned, and it must be re-earned with every generation. So I think for us, it's also an awakening and a pointer that even though we have certain guarantees provided by the law, our constitutional architecture and our legislation, however, advancing or being able to enjoy those rights require a daily effort and daily participation by us and daily demanding for expansion of these freedoms to the greatest extent possible, so that we can be able to reach the free category, which essentially we should be aspiring to one day to have a ranking as a free economy.
The question by Dominic on whether healthcare and education are public goods, they are not. They are not. Obviously, they are excludable. They are excludable. So you can't term them. So they are private goods, but they have positive externalities. Because if you educate, for example, 16, like for Kenya, case of Kenya, 16, 17 million youth, you change you change you improve the labor market structure, and you actually you're able to make it's an efficient outcome. On the question on that security can still be provided by private sector, yes, but security, that would be private security, but the just public law and order is still an efficient outcome, is a public good and should be provided by government of Kenya. I support, absolutely, I support also, I just joined Jackie to support the comment on regulatory efficiency. And Dominic, you've cited the George Stigler's paper, the inaugural paper on regulatory capture, and that actually what you want us is that the problem of regulatory capture, it takes time. It's actually, you have to review it through different technical skills to be able to make it known, because it takes time for people to even notice it. But it should be the regulation should be a priority, and it should be. And we also had that part of the state-owned entities, when you mix political power and now you promote state-owned entities in the market, and you add it to now the problem of regulatory capture, you efficiently, while people would claim, for example, that Kenya is more an open economy. In essence, coupled with those factors, that political power, promoting state-owned entities, the problem of regulatory capture, the problem of dwindling trade freedoms, and these other things together, coupled together, actually make it a problem to allow for that growth. So I agree on that, absolutely 100%. On the question about private property, land, can private firms be included in private management and property protection? I think some of that is already ongoing. The only thing is we've not seen innovation around land registration and land management in Kenya. Most of those laws are still part of those older at least those laws from the independence period, because it makes the process lengthy. It makes the process lengthy. Number two, the discretion that those public officials have over the process and the kind of things that happen actually make it a fertile ground for those people who want to extract rents. Those people hold power over that, and private sector, crude private sector players have organized themselves to actually fleece Kenyans of cash and that. So I agree. Part of the thing is to think about how to deal with the land problem. Case studies for private courts and performance. Yeah. So we agree, Dominic, for that private case resolution can be a way, but still, we still like to have that public that public good aspect of the case resolution to be very strong and very, because if you have criminal cases, for example, that it's the state versus person X, and you have 400,000 of those cases being filed annually. You have to have that judiciary to resolve, to be able to resolve that. But I get, and I know that as a strong libertarian, Dominic, that that mostly people believe that strong libertarians believe that there are 4 agencies of government that should only be allowed, that the rest should be privatized. But for us, we want to see as a constitutional law and economy program that constitutional order that Kenyans agreed to in 2010, and largely the global norms and conventions, including the work on public goods, be adhered to, and that those freedoms can be guaranteed if these agencies commit to those few things, and most importantly, allow the openness of that of the economy to thrive. So, in conclusion, John, that our commitment to continue tracking economic freedoms, that we'll be able to write a more detailed brief on this so that we to our members. Thank you.
Thanks to both Jackie and Kemboi for that presentation and just breaking down the index of the economic freedom. I believe we've learned a thing or two, and as they both, as Kemboi has noted, is that we'll have additional blog pieces, and on this, just to break this down further, which you can refer. We'll obviously post it on our website. We'll also post a link of the entire report index. I think there's also a brief brief for each of the countries, and we'll also post the presentation. I know, Dominic, you had a question around whether I mean, the health, education, those two sectors are often termed as public goods, and I think Kemboy responded to that. And just to mention that basically, actually, we have a publication that we call the 52 Economic Fallacies, and my colleagues from the Popular Economics Program will be hosting various or several webinars to just take the public through those different fallacies. And of course, one of the we have those two fallacies about education and health, often termed as public goods, and yet they are not. So that publication basically tries to demystify and argue why those are not. I mean, basically debunk those fallacies. As Kemboy explained, basically education has positive externalities or benefits. For instance, the aspect of having an educated workforce, or obviously when you have an educated population, that improves literacy levels. So those are benefits. And those benefits is what can be termed as a public good. Yeah, so look out for, you can look out for look out for advertisements or publicity on the webinars that will break down and discuss some of those issues or fallacies, the economic fallacies, and obviously the education and health will be one of those that we'll discuss soon. Otherwise, thanks a lot, Jackie and Kemboy.